Above the stratum spinosum layer is the layer called the stratum granulosum. Like the stratum spinosum, there are several layers of cells in the stratum granulosum, but not as many as what you find in the stratum spinosum. Generally 3 to 5 layers or so. The more startling thing about the stratum granulosum is that the cells are going to no longer have this cuboidal or polyhedral shape. They're going to start to look a little more flattened, a little more elongated. The other thing that you'll notice is that they become very dark when they're stained because they're full of these granules of material. Now, the word that we use to describe a cell that is becoming more elongated, more flattened, is squamous. They're becoming more and more like squamous epithelial cells. The cells in the stratum granulosum are still keratinocytes. Remember, they're rising upwards from the stratum spinosum, but they're taking on this new shape, and they're getting filled up with these granules, which are actually keratin. Now, the other thing that's happening in the stratum granulosum is that these keratinocytes are starting to die. If you go underneath an electron microscope and you look at cells in this layer, you'll notice that their organelles are starting to break down and get degraded. These cells are dying, and they're being filled up with keratin. The layer above the stratum granulosum is called the stratum lucidum. This layer has maybe 2 to 3 layers of cells in it, and these cells are going to appear much more translucent than the stratum granulosum. In fact, sometimes they have almost a clear appearance to them under the microscope. Now, the most important thing to remember about the stratum lucidum is that this is a layer of epidermis that is only found in thick skin. If you recall, we said there are 4 layers in thin skin to the epidermis, and there are 5 layers in thick skin. That 5th layer, that extra layer that is found only in thick skin, is the stratum lucidum. The cells in the stratum lucidum are those keratinocytes that have just come up through the stratum granulosum. The reason that they become translucent or clear is because they start to fill up with another kind of protein called elidin. I have the pronunciation right here for us. Elidin is actually produced from keratin. And as the keratin is maturing and helping to make this elidin, the elidin is going to provide protection from ultraviolet light. If you think about the skin on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet, one of the things that you know about it is that it doesn't get tanned when you go out in the sun. This layer, this extra layer in thick skin, provides protection from tanning because it's protecting you from ultraviolet light. And it's the elidin that's doing that protection. On this slide, you're looking at a light microscope image through the integument. This is the stratum basale, that single layer of cells right at the bottom of the dark pink or magenta colored cells. This is stratum basale. So everything above it is epidermis. Everything below it is dermis. Just above the stratum basale is stratum spinosum, many layers of stratum spinosum. Where it turns this dark purple color, that's stratum granulosum. Then suddenly it gets much lighter again, almost a light bluish color. That is stratum lucidum. These cells are dying, and they're getting filled up not only with keratin, but with elidin. The last and uppermost layer, remember, is called the stratum corneum. Now, the stratum corneum, or the uppermost layer of the epidermis, is packed with cells, 20 to 30 layers of epithelial cells up here. The stratum corneum, though, is loaded with flattened or squamous cells, which is why the 20 or 30 layers doesn't take up quite as much room as you might think. On this image on the right-hand side of the slide, the stratum basale would be right here at the bottom of that greenish colored layer. So everything above it would be epidermis. This tissue down here is dermis. So stratum basale, the rest of the green layer is stratum spinosum. Then you have a very dark green layer of stratum granulosum. There's a layer of stratum lucidum in here, which is pretty indistinguishable from the stratum corneum above it. So stratum corneum is full of now dead keratinocytes. They have become fully flattened, and they are completely stuffed with keratin at this point. Once an epithelial cell reaches this state, it's dead, it's flattened, it's full of keratin, we describe that cell as being cornified. Now, those cornified cells have a purpose. They are providing a very tough, protective outer layer to the integument. Essentially, it's a layer of membrane surrounding just a big load of keratin at that point. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the chemicals that gets stored in our skin that helps give our skin part of its color is beta-carotene. And it turns out that beta-carotene is stored in the stratum corneum. So normally we encourage people to eat lots of beta-carotene because beta-carotene is the chemical that our body will convert into vitamin A. So it's an important part of a healthy diet. It is possible, though, to overconsume beta-carotene. And just like anything else that you would eat too much of, it's not good for you. It causes a disorder called keratinosis cutis. Now, if you look at the image on the lower left-hand side of your screen, you can see two hands. This is the hand of a person with normal skin color. This is the hand of a person with keratinosis cutis. And I think you can see it's a very distinctive, sort of an orangey color. Now, keratinosis cutis is not a particularly deadly disease. It's not something to be trifled with because too much vitamin A is toxic. So a person who developed this disorder would want to get medical care for this. But the bigger issue sometimes with people developing keratinosis cutis is that this color to your skin can be mistaken for another disease called jaundice. A lot of these folks take on this yellowy orange color, and people around them think, oh, you're jaundiced. There's something wrong with your liver. In actuality, they've just consumed much too much beta-carotene, and their body is storing it right now in the upper layers of their skin. So that finishes the different strata of the epidermis. And remember, there are two layers in the integument. There's epidermis, which tends to be the thinner layer, and then dermis, which tends to be the thicker layer. What we're going to do now is switch gears and start to talk about the dermis. Now, unlike the epidermis, which is a stratified epithelium, the dermis is made out of connective tissue proper. And if you recall from our discussion of connective tissue proper, there are two kinds. There's what we call loose and dense. Now, just as a reminder, all tissues contain two things. They contain a combination of cells and a substance called extracellular matrix. In epithelial tissue, there's lots and lots and lots of cells, very little extracellular matrix. It's different in connective tissue proper. Remember, we said extracellular matrix is made out of three things. It's made out of protein fibers, ground substance, and water. Connective tissue proper is composed of cells, protein fibers, ground substance, and water. Now, remember too that we talked about both wandering cells and resident cells when it comes to connective tissue. The wandering type of cell that's going to be seen in the dermis is referred to as a dendritic cell. So this is basically a generalized immune cell. It looks a lot like the Langerhans cell that you see in the epidermis, but it doesn't get its own special name. It's just a more generalized type of dendritic cell. It's going to have those tentacle extensions coming off of it, and it's going to be a wandering or a moving type of cell performing immune functions in the dermis. So when you look at the dermis compared to the epidermis, the dermis has many, many, many fewer cells in it. The epidermis, because it's epithelium, is loaded with cells that are all very close together. The dermis is different. Now, if you remember when we talked about extracellular matrix, we said there were three different kinds of protein fibers in it: collagen, elastic, and reticular. In the dermis, all three kinds of protein fibers are found. Collagen is the most common, though, and that's true throughout the body. The dermis is the thicker layer in the integument. It ranges from about 1/2 of a millimeter upwards of about 4 millimeters in thickness. We looked at this drawing a little bit earlier, so we'll come back to it now and take a look at the dermis in a little more detail. Remember, the epidermis is in the upper layers here. This dark purple line right here represents the stratum basale. I'm just tracing it along. That is the very bottom of the epidermis. So everything above it is epidermis. Everything below that point down to the level of these blood vessels is dermis. So from here to about here, that's dermis. And you'll see that that is a much thicker layer compared to the epidermis. And of course, below the dermis, below the integument, is the hypodermis. Now, inside the dermis, there are two layers. There are 4 or 5 layers in the epidermis, but there are only 2 in the dermis. There's what we call the papillary layer up top, and then the thicker reticular layer down at the bottom. Let's start with the papillary layer. So this is the upper layer of the dermis. This is what lies just underneath the basement membrane of the epidermis. The papillary layer is composed of connective tissue proper, and specifically loose areolar connective tissue proper. Now, if you remember when we talked about connective tissue, what makes areolar connective tissue unique is that it has an extensive blood supply, and that's why you saw so many blood vessels in that drawing. Really, the reason that that blood supply is important is because that's the blood supply, not just for the dermis, but for the epidermis above it. Remember, when we talked about epithelial tissue, which is what the epidermis is made out of, one of the characteristics that we said epithelial tissue has is that it is relatively vascular. There's just no blood supply up in the epidermis. So it makes sense that there's a lot of blood supply in the papillary layer of the dermis. Now, the other thing to notice about the papillary layer is that it makes these sort of hills and ridges that bump up into the epidermis. These are what some people describe as egg crate projections. If you've ever seen that kind of foam that some people use on their mattress or underneath their mattress called egg crate foam, that's what the papillary layer looks like. Now, in this image at the bottom of the slide, we're looking at epidermis in the darker colors, and then dermis down below in the lighter pink colors. Now, if we're just looking at the dermis, this is the bottom, right around here, of the papillary layer. So everything from here up in the light pink area. This is all papillary layer. Now, you might look at this and say, I can't tell any difference from throughout all of this light pink area. The only difference is that the papillary layer doesn't have this sort of disorganized look to it so much, and it also doesn't have all of these purple colored cells in it. It's a little bit less cellular. It looks a little more compacted papillary layer. Now, these hills that you're looking at here in light pink, those are those egg crate projections I was mentioning. We give these a name. We call these dermal papillae. So these little light pink hills that reach up into the epidermis, those are called dermal papillae. So the papillary layer is made out of loose connective tissue proper, and specifically the areolar variety. Now, on this slide, down at the bottom, you're looking at a drawing of the integument, and what the artist has done is pulled up the epidermis off of the dermis. So this is dermis down here. This is epidermis up here. The stratum basale layer would be the dark purple line. Now, the reason that the artist has done this is to show us that at the top of the dermis, in the papillary layer, there are these hills, these mountains, that we call dermal papillae. And they're going to move upwards into the epidermis. They interdigitate, in other words, with the epidermis. Now, the reason that these dermal papillae are there, the reason that they're important, is because they help keep the dermis and the epidermis connected to each other. It's just a way for these two layers of very different types of tissue to be interconnected, to have more contact between each other. Now, the dermal papillae in the papillary layer are where we find another special structure that we need to know about that happens to be related to sensory perception. Remember, that was one of the functions, one of the 6 functions of the integument. The integument is responsible for the perception of things like touch and pressure. We talked about Merkel's cells being in the stratum basale. Well, in the dermal papillae, there's another structure called a Merkel's disc. Now, what a Merkel's disc is a structure, a widened sort of suction cup structure on the ends of the sensory neurons, on the ends of their nerve fibers. that connect to the Merkel cells. The Merkel cells, remember, are specialized in that they can respond to touch and pressure. And what the Merkel cells do is send that information along through the Merkel's disc and on up the sensory neuron. On this slide, you're looking at this little piece of the integument that came out of somebody's finger, and they've blown it up for us so we can take a look at the structure. Everything from the yellow layer upward is epidermis, and everything below that is dermis. Dermis has two layers. It has a papillary layer up top and a reticular layer below that. The papillary layer contains the dermal papillae, the little pink hills that you can see here. I forgot to mention on the previous slide, but wherever the epidermis comes downward, we call those epidermal ridges. So the downward structures are called epidermal ridges. The upward structures are called dermal papillae. Now, in the papillary layer, remember we said, we also find these structures called Merkel's discs. And they're showing us these discs just from very, very far away. So wherever you see this purple line here coming up in contact with the upper layer of the dermis, that's representing a Merkel's disc. Take a look at this drawing, this small drawing on the right-hand side of the slide. This is a representation of what the very tip of a neuron looks like. These are what we refer to as free nerve endings. So just these extensions at the ends of nerves that are picking up information from the environment. Now, nerve endings can just be these, kind of naked and unremarkable, or they can be adapted for very particular types of sensory perception. So when a nerve ending at the very tip, when it is shaped like a suction cup, like this one, we call that a Merkel's disc. Merkel's discs are going to come up in contact with Merkel's cells. The Merkel's cells, remember, are in the Stratum Basale. The Merkel's discs are in the layer just below that, the papillary layer of the dermis. So the disc structure is going to receive the information from the cell that sits above it. Now I want you to notice that there are a couple other funny looking structures in this drawing as well. There's what's called a Raffini corpuscle or a Raffini organ, a Papillary corpuscle, and a Meissner corpuscle. These are all just variations of one of these specialized nerve endings. The Merkel's disc is one type of specialized nerve ending. The Raffini corpuscle is another kind. The Papillary corpuscle is another kind. And the Meissner corpuscle is another kind. So these are all just strangely shaped nerve endings. And they are lying in the dermis at various levels in the dermis, and they're picking up sensory information in the skin. This is just another drawing, a more simplistic drawing that represents the same thing. Everything from this very light colored layer upwards represents epidermis, and everything below it represents dermis. So these hills here would be called dermal papillae, and the very light colored downward projections would be called epidermal ridges. This is a nerve ending, and it happens to be shaped like a suction cup. This is a Merkel's disc. Here's a representation of the nerve here in white, and you can see it's sending out nerve endings. Here's a Meissner's corpuscle. It tucks right up into that dermal papillae. Here's that one of those Raffini corpuscles. Here's a Paxinian corpuscle. They're all located throughout the dermis, and they're all picking up sensory information.